everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner.
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution. We've overtaxed people. People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. And with us today, we've got Walter Hudson and Shaine Parr. Walter, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, folks, glad to be here again. Glad to see you again, Jeremy and Shaine. I am a city council member in Albertville, Minnesota, just outside of the Twin Cities metro area. And I've long been an activist in and around the Republican Party and a commentator, former associate editor of Newsreel blog and a contributor to PJ Media before becoming an elected official at the local level. And so I'm bringing the activist perspective to our commentary and doing my level best to define what we are for as conservatives as opposed to just the things we are against.
And Shaine Parr.
Hey guys, I'm glad to be here. Also with Walter and Jeremy, getting an education every week on Minnesota politics, and I'm just basically your average voter. My background's in media, so I've also hosted radio just like Walter, but my hosting has mostly been in sports radio. Had a syndicated sports program called The View from the Couch for many years, and I'm active politically in Minnesota as far as I vote and that sort of thing. But I wouldn't call myself an activist. I'm not in politics like you guys are. I guess the closest I've ever been is I was a Ron Paul delegate way back in 2008. I think that's about the time that I first ran into you, Walter, many, many years ago. But that's about it for me.
Well, good. I mean, I think that the three perspectives that we have from politics inside and outside the Capitol are a good fit for talking about issues every week. So I appreciate your time and helping to spread this message. So, Walter, what's first on your docket of things you want to tackle this week?
Well, I guess the thing that is top of mind, just based upon recent and pending conversations that I'm having, is this week's celebration, recognition, marking of the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. I mean, you would think that this guy was JFK or MLK. In fact, I'm surprised we haven't learned his middle name, and we're starting to refer to him by his initials just to make it official. The extent to which retroactively the left and the media, pardon the redundancy, have attempted to turn this guy into some sort of cultural saint and revered public figure is astonishing, particularly as it takes place in front of the backdrop of shots fired, quite literally. I'm sure you guys saw the video of the reporter who was broadcasting from what is unofficially deemed, and I'm sure soon officially will be called, George Floyd Square. And there's a drive-by shooting going on in the background. I mean, it would be comical if it wasn't so serious.
Yeah, it's amazing. I grabbed a clip off of Twitter when that AP reporter was talking about the issue, the police, the defund the police movement gaining momentum or whatever, and then you saw that gunfire. So I grabbed a clip and put it out there like this just in before the moment of silence. A moment is people in South Minneapolis show their moment of silence. But it's so frequent in Minneapolis. It would be hard to sit and record a 5-minute segment and not have gunfire somewhere in the city. And it was telling. I think it was an embarrassment for the liberals out there, especially those that are supporting defunding the police, to see this criminal activity and deaths, young kids getting shot. And I posted on Facebook just in the last couple of days about how there's a downtown coalition of business owners who are about to launch a marketing campaign to bring people downtown. And then in the same night, there was, the shooting where 2 people were killed and 8 people shot. So I kind of put those side by side and said, I hope that a marketing campaign is not just what they're planning on doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's tone deaf and then there's just stupid. And I think we're into the just stupid phase of this campaign and this reaction to what's taking place in Minneapolis. Look, here's what folks who are supportive of the BLM narrative have to be confronted with. Whoever was responsible for that shooting that took place behind the AP reporter at George Floyd Square, those individuals have more in common with George Floyd than George Floyd has with any of the other revered figures throughout history who have been honored in the way that he is being honored now. This is not JFK. This is not MLK. This isn't some, statesman who's being laid to rest. This is a guy who, lest we forget, and look, it's not like I want to go around telling this story and highlighting this aspect of George Floyd's life, but I have the responsibility to do so as a response to the elevation that he's being granted in the culture and in the media. George Floyd was part of a gang of men who forced their way into a pregnant woman's home. And George Floyd personally held a gun to her belly in which lied her child and coerced her and threatened her. He was convicted. I heard a Vice News report that was from a few months ago, about 11 months ago, where they were telling the story of George Floyd and who George Floyd was. And, this is what he was all about. And they mentioned this, and the way they phrased it was, in 2009, 2010, George Floyd was accused by law enforcement of having been involved in a home invasion. He was convicted, okay? He was not just accused. He was convicted in a court of law. And so if you're going to stand and say that Derek Chauvin ought to be condemned by history after the process that he went through of being convicted by a jury of his peers, then you must, if you're intellectually consistent, say at least the same thing about George Floyd. And we don't have that consistency.
Well, and how does it feel for that victim of his to see his face on the sides of buildings and on TV constantly? I mean, do we ever think about that? The trauma that she's got to go through for the rest of her life with that?
Yeah, and I saw that a lot of conservatives were posting responses to people asking for a moment of silence. They were frustrated. They were upset. They were upset that there was a message, a proclamation by the governor requesting 9 minutes and whatever seconds of silence in the schools. People were mad. People were posting memes about, congratulations, George Floyd. It's been a year that you've been sober, drug-free or whatever. I mean, it was pretty digs. But I actually wanted to reflect on this last year. And so I put out a post about that it's been 1 year since a string of bad decisions by government, right? This was the night where, a year ago tonight, and this is the day after the celebration, whatever, a year ago, there were riots in the streets and the governor was doing nothing to stop it, right? This is what a 1 year anniversary for me is about. And this was bad decisions at all levels of government, including Chauvin, right? That was a bad decision that he made. It was a bad decision that the mayor made, the bad decision that the governor made. And it went on and on so long that the riots grew across our country. Our caucus put out a statement saying a year ago, George Floyd was arrested for passing a bad $20 bill at a convenience store on Minneapolis South Side. And then we talked about the link of the chain of events and how George Floyd was out of work because of the governor's restrictions on bars, right? He was a bouncer at a nightclub. It threw him out of work. And he was a drug addict. And we know that the lockdowns, what that did to people who were drug addicts, right? And then what's the worst thing you can do to a drug addict? Tell him to stay home, tell him to be alone, and then send him a check for $4,000 or whatever the stimulus checks went out, right? Drug addicts there was overdoses all the time because drug addicts weren't working, and we sent them a whole bunch of extra spending money. So government had a role in putting George Floyd in the situation where he was, in desperation, in an addict, and we did this to a lot of people. And so we talked about how we made millionaires out of some of these business owners and destroyed lives of others. We talk about a year ago, we can sit and reflect on how the looters went out and stole their flat screen TVs or their booty, their sneakers, and in the name of George Floyd, how non-profiteers were, raking in the millions of dollars from big corporations over the past year because of George Floyd, and how George Floyd's family got $27 million from taxpayers, another $13 million from the GoFundMe, and yet nothing substantial has actually changed. We actually haven't evolved as a society any better than we were a year ago. There's just been a lot of money that's changed hands, and then communities across the country, across the world, that are heavy minority communities have been decimated. They burned down businesses in their own neighborhoods all over the country, and that's where we are a year later. That was my reflection of looking back a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, look, take the before and after picture, right? If you live in Minneapolis, was your life better a year and a half ago or now? I don't know how you could possibly make the argument that it's better now, given what we're seeing.
You can't use COVID. I mean, you're including COVID in there. But if we're talking about George Floyd, or are we talking about COVID? Because if you look at the racial tensions, from before George Floyd, I don't think anything has improved after George Floyd a year later.
Not at all.
No, I'm talking about, I mean, you take COVID out of it. I'm talking about the quality of life in Minneapolis. In other words, when you yield to the premises of Black Lives Matter and defund the police, and you run your policy and your city accordingly, and you see the results in the street, what is better? Is life better now there, or is it better before, when we still had a passing resemblance of law and order to some extent?
I got into this conversation online just the other day. It was actually in reference to the video of the bullets flying behind the AP guy,
drive-by reporter.
The reporter, yeah. Geez, yeah. I can't tonight. But this friend of mine was like, well, how do you know the quality of life? Maybe this is something that you need to wake up to as a white man and whatever, and I was like, you know what, man, I lived about 10 blocks from there for the better half of a decade, and I don't remember a single time that I lived there that I heard gunshots in the middle of the daytime. I probably heard them a couple times at real late at night, but that was even few and far between. I mean, to have this happen on live television going out across the world, we've hit a new low there.
Well, I as a white guy, it's pretty hard for me to get deep into this conversation on race relations, but looking back at like the pivotal points in the last, in my lifetime for race relations, the death of Trayvon Martin, remember in Florida, that was in 2012. For me, that's when a lot of the activism started in recent memory. And that was that 9 years ago, right? 9 years ago, Trayvon Martin was killed. And from there, we had, Missouri, another major activism moment. And I don't think race relations, with all of that work in progress, or activism, has actually improved anything. It's polarized a lot of things. It's actually, I think, which makes things worse. But the attack on police for the past 9 years has been terrible. I've got even a local police chief here that can't find people to fill a position that's been open. Nobody, and he has officers after 5 years wanting to leave. So it's tough. That's a tough industry. And a lot of this is on the police. And I don't think things have improved over the past 9 years.
No. And they need to be accountable for that. The people who are advancing the ideas that are manifesting in these terrible trajectories need to be held accountable for those ideas. These are obviously bad ideas, because when we follow them, when we allow them to affect policy, these are the results. That's how we know. It's not conjecture. It's not theory. The proof is in the pudding, and this pudding sucks.
Yeah, that's pretty bold. You're right. Yeah. Well, where do we go from here? I want to jump into some police reform stuff that's bubbling around in the Capitol yet. So the legislative session ended. we technically don't continue our legislative session until next February. But we obviously know that there will be a special session, which is of itself its own, what we do in 2 years condensed into a day or 2 or 3. So there's no bills introduced for the special session. So everything will be introduced as if, House file number 1, House file number 2, starting from scratch. But obviously the legislation is going to be copied from what we have done, and then whatever they think of in the back rooms in these negotiations between the House and Senate. So we had conference committees working on public safety legislation, right? The House passed all of these bills to, fix the police, and the Senate really doesn't want to do anything. And those 2 conference committees are ended, but they've turned into working groups. And those people are basically sending offers back and forth right now, how much to spend and what policy to adopt. So somewhere between now and June 14th, those guys are going to come with an agreement on things they want to change and put it into legislation. Some of the stuff may be things we've never heard in committee, and then they'll come to the floor as a public safety / healthcare / education spending policy bill that we'll have to vote on. But the Senate, Gazelka came out and really said he is not interested in doing any police reforms, because we tackled a big bill last year, which did a bunch of little things, and he's not interested in having the conversation. But that's kind of where we're at. I don't think any substantial police reforms are going to happen in the special session, and likely not even next year during the thick of the campaign season.
I don't know what reforms should happen in this environment. Because whatever's produced at this point is not going to be the result of thoughtful deliberation and considered policy based upon any sort of logic or statistical analysis or moral premises that can be well articulated. It's going to be all reactionary and fueled entirely by the most absurd premises of the left. And it's going to push us closer down the path that we were just talking about, this trajectory of more crime, more permissiveness, less law enforcement, less people willing to join and serve because they know they're not appreciated. As official government policy of the state of Minnesota, they're not appreciated. They're held under contempt and suspicion. It's like it's absurd to expect, like, who's this person that we think we're going to recruit to be a police officer? Somebody who wants to do the right thing, wants to uphold the law, wants to serve their community, and is so excited about doing that they're willing to accept the suspicion and the scrutiny and the presumption of guilt and potentially having their life completely destroyed if they ever make a mistake. Nobody's going to sign up for that.
All right. Well, Shaine, you're pretty libertarian leaning in your political beliefs. What is your opinion of ending qualified immunity? And first of all, you know what that is?
I do.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's talk about it for the listeners. So qualified immunity is ending qualified immunity is what much of the Democrats are pushing. Many of the Democrats are pushing in the House. And basically, if you were to end qualified immunity, it would mean that the officers themselves would be personally liable for doing harm, whether it's an accidental shooting, whether it's misuse of force, excessive use of force, all of these things, sexual harassment and stuff. They would be personally liable for their damages. And so, like doctors are, for those who don't, doctors are actually personally liable for botching your surgery. So in order to be working in that profession, doctors go out and buy liability insurance to protect them for botching a surgery or doing harm to people. And so if police would have to do the same thing, if they would have to go out and get a liability insurance policy to protect them for bad behavior, that policy likely wouldn't just cost $2,000 a month. It would be based on that officer's record. And so the insurance company would want to have access to the personnel file to see how many complaints are lodged against this person, to see how quote unquote aggressive of an officer that person is. And then their insurance premiums would reflect their behavior. And so if the officer was receiving a lot of complaints, their insurance premiums would go up and then eventually their insurance premiums may go up so high after so many complaints or so many actions of excessive force that officer would say, you know what, I can't afford to be an officer anymore. I can't pay $6,000 a month because I work in a tough neighborhood where I've had all these complaints lodged against me, and the officer will go. That's a way to basically use the free market to get rid of bad apples. That's kind of the philosophy behind it. But in reality, I don't think police departments have done this, but it would I think cause a lot of people not to be police officers. And right now, look what happened. The city of Minneapolis, the taxpayers had to pay $27 million to George Floyd, to his family, because of an officer's action. So if Chauvin had that one cost to him, maybe it wouldn't be 27 million. Maybe it would be $500,000. But anyways, what do you? So Shaine, what's your opinion on ending qualified immunity?
Yeah, I do support ending qualified immunity. I just think it's one of those things that you brought up the doctor argument. I understand the argument against it, and like you're saying, I mean it. I'm one of the people that's looking out here right now and thinking, why would anybody want to be a police officer? And I understand that makes that even tougher to hire cops. But at the same time, I think it's one of those things that, it's something that we have seen abused in the past. And I think you could go about it in a way where, you could be a little nuanced about it, I think, and I don't, like I said, I'm not a legislator. I don't really know the ins and outs of how you would do that. But it seems to me like between not doing anything about it and getting rid of it, I definitely would support getting rid of it altogether.
Walter, how about you?
In the past, I've leaned more in the direction of getting rid of it. Currently, I would not want to, and I would oppose getting rid of it. And the reason why is because it's the concept, it's the premise, right? You talked about the free market regulating the behavior of police. That would not happen because we don't have one. There is no free market. This is a highly regulated political market. $27 million for killing George Floyd? Really? On what basis? Where'd you come up with that number? No, I mean, I know that that's the number. I'm just saying, like, in terms of administering justice, how is that what the family is due for what happened to George Floyd? What about these families these past couple of weeks who've lost their children in gunfire on the streets? How much money are they getting? And from who? And on what basis? Why is $27 million to George Floyd morally above board, and nothing, which is what I presume the parents of these children who've been shot by gangbangers in the street? How is that justice? What we have is a system whereby if you take away qualified immunity for police, it is going to be, pun intended, open season on every single individual police officer to either drum them out of the force and therefore affect through the free market the defunding of the police, or neuter them to the point where they don't react, they're ineffective, and they basically are all that deputy outside of Parkland who wouldn't go in when he heard the shots fired because, it's not my job to defend children. That's the direction that we're headed if we go forward with this. And I think that it has become, for me, it's an emergent realization that as libertarians, we tend to view policy proposals in a kind of a laboratory of our own minds, where it's like, oh yeah, if the world functioned the way it's supposed to, then this would be a great idea. And that's true. But the world doesn't function the way it's supposed to. It functions the way it does. And so in this world, in terms of when we have a responsibility to affect the best possible outcome for people right now, I don't know that I could support qualified immunity abolition or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I've heard arguments on both sides. I'm not supportive of it right now. I think we have to figure out a better solution to it. I just looked up what Justine Damon's settlement was. She was the Australian woman who called police because she thought somebody was being raped, and then the police show up, and Mohammed Noor shot her point blank right in the chest. I mean, she wasn't even she wasn't even the perp, and she was shot. But that was the largest settlement Minneapolis had ever paid out, $20 million in what was that, 2019. So $27 million for George Floyd is, obviously way larger than that. And if it were up to, private insurance companies to negotiate this and justify what the payments were, it probably would be less. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, right or wrong. But I think we need to figure out a way to get rid of the bad apples, the few bad actors that there are in law enforcement, and protect those who are good. And one of the best ways I see as doing that is to end binding arbitration. So if you're a teacher or you're a police officer and you do something bad that needs to be disciplined and they want to get rid of you, the unions step in and use what they have now, which is mandatory arbitration, meaning they have to go to an arbitrator and that person reviews the case and decides, and then you are bound, because of binding arbitration, you are bound to that decision. And the way that they choose arbitrators today is based on the arbitrator's history of being fair and siding 50-50 on these cases. So unlike an administrative law judge, which is the other route to go in front of an administrative law judge who decides, the arbitrators are chosen based on a history 50-50, meaning you basically, as a police chief, have a 50-50 shot of working with this officer again, should you choose to fire them, which ruffles some feathers, not just with the person you're firing, but all of their friends on the force. So then you have to deal with 50-50 shot of that person coming back into the workforce. And so people tend not to get rid of, not to try to get rid of someone unless it's a very serious offense, as opposed to if they started throwing all these low level things to try to get rid of somebody, or reasons that were iffy. If it was still 50-50, you know what I mean? It works out the pattern, because it's 50-50 it works against binding. It makes binding arbitration end up being a way to keep the bad apples working. And this is both for teachers and police officers, right? And if you look at like New York City, for instance, I posted this article about how there's like 700 teachers that are accused of like inappropriately touching school kids. They're not in the classroom. They're sitting, they go to work every day and they sit in the room and do nothing and get full salary because of binding arbitration. They basically said, you can't get rid of them. Like, well, I don't want to put them in a classroom with kids, and they end up sitting doing nothing. I don't know if there's the equivalent for police officers, but they probably just go back on the force. But
I got
talked to, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I got to say that if it came down between qualified immunity and what you're talking about, I'd definitely settle for what you're talking about in that argument. I mean, if we could kind of take some of the power away from the unions in these cases, I'm all for it.
Yeah, so I think ending binding arbitration is something that we've had police chief, in fact, Miller brought it up because Miller is on the Public Safety Conference Committee where they're talking about this stuff. And he's the only Republican from the House that was chosen to be, actually, an odd thing, he's not even serving on the Public Safety Committee. And yet they chose him to be the Republican on that conference committee, a very important one, instead of all the Republicans on the committee. So that's an amazing win for our caucus. But Miller's on there, and he brought up binding arbitration, ending that. And there was police chiefs that came and testified in favor, saying, look, honestly, a lot of cops will say, no, we need that because it's a kind of a protection. But the police chiefs do think that that's a way for them to get rid of the few bad actors, so that we can. And I think it would, if we could get it to apply to teachers too, that would be awesome.
Well, and that's a big part of the reason why I think qualified immunity is not the answer, because qualified immunity is a solution that looks attractive on paper. It's easy to explain, and it's easy to get people to nod their heads and be like, yeah, we should do that. That's a good idea. But what it doesn't address is any of the broader systemic issues that are contributing to the problem. Binding arbitration is a great example of one of those issues, because what you just described, a process for disciplinary action that effectively guarantees that 50% of the people who you fire are going to end up back on the force or back in the school system or whatever the case may be. Just think about the trajectory that places you on. Trajectories is kind of the theme of the night here tonight. What it does is, like you said, you're not going to put somebody through the disciplinary process unless they've done something really, really super bad. But then that pool of people who've done something really, really super bad, 50% of them are still going to come back. So you're guaranteeing that 50% of the worst people on your workforce are going to be with you for all time. Why? Because of some stupid arbitrary rule that some bureaucrat moron came up with and that we all go along with for some reason.
Yeah.
That's definitely the kind of thing that needs to change.
And I'm not saying that 50% have to come back, but the arbitrators are chosen based on their record of being fair, which is the 50-50.
Which means that, in effect, you're talking about arbitrators who, in order to be chosen, have to have a record of 50-50, which means in their mind, they are self-policing 50-50. So whether or not that ends up being the final outcome or not, it's certainly going to be the tendency. You're going to tend in a direction where people who probably should be fired won't be, because arbitrators want to keep their jobs. It's a very perverse incentive.
Yeah, and it's also important to know with binding arbitration, there is a higher level of privacy for these cases. So like a lot of the management process and the reviews and stuff remains private. And then one of the other things I wanted to point out about ending qualified immunity is we talk about it kind of being a free market, but all it takes is on social media somebody to say, hey, Brooklyn Center it ended qualified immunity. So let's go out and file complaints against every one of these guys. You know what I mean? And it just creates a perverse incentive to start filing more and more complaints against officers. And yeah, this person pulled me over and they, used a racist word or whatever. And so that creates an incentive for more complaints from the public. Another issue that police reforms that is being proposed by the Democrats is creating citizen review boards, citizen oversight boards. So this is where instead of having, people in law enforcement reviewing cases or reviewing issues, that you have a bunch of citizen oversight boards. And of course, we know how the left creates those boards, right? You're going to have people from all these different ethnic communities or genders or whatever, and basically hand select a board where the outcome is fairly known.
Yeah, no, that's another idea that sounds good on paper, right? Citizen review. Oh, of course, I want citizens to review. I want citizens to have input on how these things are going to go, how they're consent of the governed. I mean, it has a nice libertarian ring to it even. But as you say, these are bodies that are going to be stacked with activists who have the same attitude as one of the jurors from the Derek Chauvin trial, which is, I'm here to affect change. Not I'm here to weigh the evidence and look at what happened and see whether or not it's consistent with training and the letter of the law, but I'm here to affect change and to strike a blow for social justice. That is most definitely not what we need. And what would be lacking from that is any professionalism, any expertise. Anybody who actually knows what the hell a cop is supposed to do and what the training is and how it works and has any experience with actually implementing it in the field.
Well, we would probably end up getting a lot of civil rights attorney wannabes appointed to the board. And, to go back to ending qualified immunity, I just want to wrap that up by reminding that if we got rid of that, getting rid of binding arbitration, sorry. If you got rid of binding arbitration, then you would have an administrative law judge review all these cases, and they can, they don't have to be 50-50 in their averages, but there is an expense to that. It costs more money. And so if there's a push to end binding arbitration, then you will see that, the unions come out and say, oh, Munson's voting to grow government or increase spending or, whatever. But so there's a cost to it. But I think in the end, if you look at how much cities have to pay out in these settlements, maybe that goes down. Maybe it's a win. Either way, Gazelka has said that he's not interested in qualified immunity or these citizen review boards. So I don't think that's going to happen in the special session, but we'll see what happens when Gazelka, wants to run for governor and if he's going to try to campaign on those issues. Well, what's next on your docket for the week there, Walter? I'll let you pick the agenda this week.
Oh, well, I wish I'd come up with a bullet point list. Well, So it's been a week or so since the governor lifted his mask mandate. And I'm kind of interested in your guys' anecdotal experience with what it's been like to venture back out from the cave and, breathe fresh air, walk into a gas station without having to remind yourself to go back to your car and grab a face diaper. For me, it's been pretty remarkable considering that I'm a grown man who thinks quite a bit about what I believe and why I believe it. That even for me, I've had this sense of hesitation and kind of like guilt or shame for walking into a grocery store or a gas station without a mask. And I think about that, and the thought that comes to me is, if that's how I feel, I can only imagine what it's like for my children, for kids generally, and for anybody who hasn't thought through their worldview as thoroughly, and has just been conditioned by this past year of abuse from our governor and from the government apparatus more generally.
I'll weigh in. That's great insight, Walter, on the guilt and the shame that you feel walking into a place without wearing a mask. Because I have no shame in it, because I actually push the limits outside of my district, because I felt bad if I walked into places in my district where they kind of know me, But on the way to St. Paul, I will walk into gas stations until somebody reminds me that I have to wear a mask. I don't want to be rude about it, but I was always tempted. I was tested at different places, but I would never be in confrontations. But I went to go pick up a pizza at a Casey's in my district, and went in with my daughter, just 10 years old, and she put a mask on as we walked in. She had it in her pocket. She snuck it and put it on. And I said, "Greta, you don't have to wear a mask." She's like, "Dad, yeah, I do." And she's like, and she was insistent that she had to. So she had been conditioned over the past year to wear a mask. And I was like, pull it down, put it below your chin. And she finally did, but she felt bad doing it. And on the way out, she reminded me, and this probably comes from school, that she is not vaccinated. She's 10. And so she has to wear a mask. That's the law. I said, no, there was a law that said everybody had to wear a mask. And then the guidance from the federal government said, you don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to wear a mask if you're vaccinated. And if you aren't vaccinated, you should. But the law in Minnesota that said everybody has to wear a mask is gone now. So now nobody has to wear a mask. It is your choice. And you are not at risk of getting COVID. So, you don't have to wear a mask. And so I felt like she was mad at me because she didn't understand the law. She wanted me to explain those details to her. But she still has to wear a mask to school. So that's, conflict for a kid.
Yep. Yeah. So do my kids. And it's how you look, they're kids, right? And because they're kids, I've been putting a lot of thought in this lately, because you often hear about kind of the "I told you so" style of parenting and how it's sort of lazy. If your kid's asking you why you should have an answer for them, that's kind of an idea that you hear articulated once in a while. And before you become a parent, you're like, "Oh yeah, my parents were really lame and they never answered my questions. And if somebody would have just explained to me, why I couldn't do something, then I would have been perfectly obedient." Of course, that's not true. And that's bared out in my own personal experience. Like I to the degree that I've tried to engage with my boys as if they had the reasoning capacity of an adult, it has always failed every single time, because they don't, right? Like children have to have, they have to have an authority structure as a replacement for, or a placeholder for, their reasoning capacity. As they develop the capacity to reason, then you can trade that out for the authority structure. And so it's in that context that the COVID zeitgeist of 2020 has been operating. And so, when your daughter is thinking about, should I be wearing a mask or shouldn't I? Where does her head go? Her head goes to, well, what does the law say? What is the rule? What have I been told I'm supposed to do? Not what makes sense, not what's the evidence. Like, she's not there yet. She's not thinking in those terms. And unfortunately, like, for children, that's totally understandable. Unfortunately, we have a whole lot of grown adults who function exactly the same way. Where it's, the CDC says, or Governor Wall says, or, some other claimed authority or expert says this is what I should be doing. Well, is there any reason to that? Does it contradict something that they were saying last week or 6 months ago? Are you concerned about that contradiction? Have they provided a sufficiently logical explanation for their 180 on this position? Is there a reason why that Thursday, that was the last day of the mask mandate, I was killing grandma if I went to the bar without a mask? And then Friday night, I was a perfectly upstanding citizen who could walk confidently with my head held high and no mask. Like, what's the logic behind any of this? And it's the drive. The greatest damage, health wise, like the real public health issue here, is not COVID. It's critical thinking and the effect that this whole episode has had upon our collective ability as individuals to think critically. Well,
you mentioned, we have this generation of older people who are not critically thinking, but, we were all brought up without this whole COVID thing. So what happens 10, 15 years from now when these kids are adults and we're making decisions about, policy and that sort of thing? How are they going to look back on what they learned growing up and apply this? It's profound.
Well, and I hope that the children growing up now with COVID or through the COVID crisis look back 10 years from now, 15 years ago as policymakers and say, I don't trust the government.
Yeah.
Because of that whole thing that happened when I was young and how it changed our society and crushed like that. I let it be a lesson. But I feel like when this kind of goes back to when I got involved in politics, I first of all, my whole family are big, far left Democrats. I'm the only conservative in my family, except for my uncle down in Missouri. Everybody else is just crazy Democrats, go to protest, to take guns and everything. So my family reunions are odd. But when was it Trump got one? He wanted to get rid of the Paris Climate Accord, and my whole Facebook blew up. This is my old personal one, which nobody out there in Facebook land is a member of. But my whole thing blew up. Everybody was like, the world is going to end. Why? Because it isn't a law. Like, if there isn't a law, it won't happen that way. We have to mandate stuff, because if you don't mandate it, it's not going to happen. And that's why so many people need to have government structure. They need to have government telling us what to do. It needs to be a law. It can't just be a, guidance. Or if the governor says it's guidance, they treat it like law. They need that hard structure. So, but I was a different child. I asked the questions, and I was kind of like the kid that we saw talking in front of the school board on social media. Did you see that video where that kid is just like putting everybody in their place? I was that kid because I was always asking questions. Everybody said, God, he's like a 40-year-old and he's 10, Funny,
but I was gonna post that to your wall and say, here's a 10-year-old Jeremy Munson. So that's perfect.
That was me. And I talked much older than I was. But one of the reasons is because my parents would explain stuff to me. But my fear is, and I was driving my 12-year-old to school, and I was telling her about this movement on Monday, that morning, about how some kids were going to go without masks as a protest. And between telling her that and telling my 10-year-old that it's not the law that they have to wear a mask, it's a guideline, and it's basically the unions pushing it, I'm empowering her to be a smart ass at school. And that's what my fear is, especially my position as a legislator, right? And so I don't want to have one of those kids that just goes to school and stirs the pot because they have enough knowledge to be dangerous.
Yeah, well, and that's why I'm giving, and Shaine, this is the first time you've heard this, but I'm giving serious consideration to alternatives to public education, because
good for you, man.
As my oldest is 12, And the older he gets, the more imminent. It's not a question of if, but when. There's going to be a serious worldview conflict between the curriculum and the education and my values. And assuming my values are transmitted to him, he is the type who likes to argue, and does not go along with just like an authority claim. Like he has to believe that it's right, or he's going to fight it. That it's going to go one of two ways. Either I get him out of that environment, or I have to have this really weird conversation with him where I'm like, look, you got to look at school as just kind of like a video game. Like you're just trying to run up the score on your grades and get past to the end of the level. Like that's it. Like you don't look at it as you're actually engaging with these ideas in any significant way. You're just trying to get to the end of the level and, collect all the coins and, meet your threshold for having done well and then get out and go on and live your real life afterwards, which is kind of a terrible advice that I don't want to give them. But if you're going to be rational and in public education, that's really the only way you can do it.
Speaking of public education, I had I can't dox him here, but a school board member call me on the Monday after the mask mandate was lifted and said, Munson, we need an attorney down here. So why? I said, well, the school board voted to lift the mask mandate in the school district on that Friday. And all hell's breaking loose because the teachers union, Education Minnesota, and the Minnesota Department of Education is threatening to cut off money. It's going to be crazy, and we need an attorney because we want to do this, and that's what the parents want, and what the kids should have is no mask mandate in school. Unfortunately, over the next few days, they caved and re-implemented the mask mandate, but it's tough. That was a big decision, and there's a lot of pressure for letting the kids go to school without masks, as they're really not at risk, and the teachers have all been vaccinated that want to be vaccinated. But they have to go to school for the 3 weeks when it's hot, and that's unfortunate. As a hobby sports photographer, which is kind of what I love, going to sporting events, and I've got these cameras with big zoom lenses, big telephoto lenses. I love taking pictures of my kids, volleyball and basketball, and it was all masked this year. And it was sad taking pictures of all these kids where they were wearing masks because you just don't see expression. And then finally, since the mask mandate was lifted, outdoor soccer games, no masks. And it was great to see faces and see expression again. And I hope that kids see that too, right? The kids haven't been able to see each other's expression for a whole year.
Yeah, I got to say my experience since the mandate has been lifted has been very liberating. And my wife and I were kind of commenting on how, at least where we are, and we traveled out to Wisconsin last weekend for a family thing. It's been nice to see how many people have really kind of come to the conclusion that, I'm done with this. Because we were kind of starting to feel a little isolated, like, geez, is there nobody out there anymore other than us and a few friends that have a clue or are, being logical about this. But, now that mandate's been lifted, it seems like people are really, really, they're just done with it, and I like seeing that. So it's been nice to see.
Now, I want to mention one thing politically. The mask mandate being lifted takes the pressure. It's a pressure relief valve, right? People were getting furious and fed up with the governor, and now that he released the mask mandate, for most people, the governor's emergency powers, they're done. I had so many people email me, does this mean I can evict my tenants that haven't paid in a year? It's like, no, his emergency orders are still in place. He ended one. That's it. But for 95% of Minnesotans, they're done, Yeah. Once the school is done, where the masks in schools, another thing, but that's really a Department of Education policy. So for people that are trying to replace the governor with a Republican one. The governor removing his mask mandate, it's a pressure relief valve. It's really what it was. He just
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm glad you brought it up because I would have forgotten, is it's very interesting to me to consider what next year looks like electorally now. Because, you know, you look at Scott Jensen, who has anybody else announced running for governor?
There's a couple of I don't want to call them fringe candidates because I should actually reach out and get to know them. There's a mayor that has announced, and
Mike something.
Yeah, and then there's another. And I'm sorry to both of these candidates for not having their names ready.
I mean, it's on them to get their name out there. So
it is. There's two candidates, and I just went to the campaign finance board yesterday to look up who's filed. Tom Bach is actually filed. Still, I mean, he's still filed. He's got an active campaign account, and he filed his public subsidy agreement with the campaign finance board. So, I mean, in January, so he's still a candidate. Yeah. And he's got $80,000 in his account. So he's not broke in his gubernatorial account.
I think it's safe to say that Scott Jensen remains the only visible candidate in terms, and the way I'm defining visible is I'm seeing his ads on Facebook. I'm seeing appearances in media. And I'm the type of person that if you're out there campaigning in a significant way as a Republican, I'm going to see you and I'm going to know your name. I'm not going to have to ask somebody else, who are you? So Scott Jensen remains the only person in that category, as far as I know. And his campaign thus far has been very heavily defined by COVID, very heavily defined by the mask mandate and by Governor Walz's emergency powers. What happens now? I mean, like you said, the perception of most people is that we're done. You know, everybody's getting vaccinated. We're approaching herd immunity. The mask mandate's over. We're hitting the beach. You know, we're going to have our city. We're going to have our summer festival here, Albertville Friendly City Days coming up. You know, it's back to normal. So how do you campaign on how terrible Governor Walz is when everybody's going to be riding high on getting outside and breathing fresh air and having a good time again?
Yeah, and I actually just saw Scott Jensen last night because he was in my district at an event, a meet and greet. So I went out and met with constituents, talked about the legislative session, spoke to Scott Jensen's campaign about his candidacy, and he's been, I think that's the third time he's been through my district. So he's out there doing a lot of events in talking about issues. But of course, Scott Jensen can talk about, you know, circles around any candidate when it comes to COVID and vaccines, which is a hot topic right now. Healthcare reform, I think, is always, I told him yesterday, it's going to be a big issue. It's like the number one budget item in for families is their healthcare costs, their health insurance costs and stuff. So that's going to be a big issue, and he has great ideas for health reforms. But yeah, you're right. Once we get over COVID, is it still going to be a campaign issue? How do we remind people of the economic destruction that the governor caused? How do we solidify people's civil liberties being eroded? And the persistent threat that the governor has if he maintains the executive orders as is, the threat that he could shut you down. Because I talked to a voter today from northern Minnesota who called me just ticked off about we want to change the emergency orders because he says, you know, it's going to happen again in September when the COVID comes back like the seasonal flu and it gets worse and there's going to be another spike. He's going to shut down the schools again. I said, medically speaking, you know, maybe, but from political science issue, no, he won't, because he'll be in the thick of the campaign. No way he'll touch that.
Yeah.
Well, Shaine, Joe Plumber Parr, as we'll use you as the average voter.
Joe Plumber, I forgot about that
guy. Being outside of the Capitol and maybe even outside of being a big activist, do you see people just forgetting about this and returning to normal and not seeing the threat of the governor shutting the state down again?
Unfortunately, I do. Like I said, just being out and I hadn't thought of that perspective really until you mentioned it. I did, obviously. I mean, being someone who's politically active, I mean, it was obvious at the beginning, and I made social media posts that this doesn't have anything to do with midterm elections coming up, gubernatorial elections coming up, or anything. That the mask mandate's lifted and that sort of thing. But looking down the road, like Walter says, I mean, so many people it's what's going on right now, what's in the moment, that sort of thing, and I think that is going to be that's going to be a hurdle that whoever it is, whether it's Scott Jensen or whoever, is going to have to keep that fresh and point out that fact, like Walter said, that we're not really, for all intents and purposes, we're not really being represented at this point, and that's got to be the issue.
And it's a great bipartisan issue. You don't have to brand it. You don't have to make it, even though I'm extremely pro-life, you don't have to be like, well, pro-lifers aren't being represented in St. Paul, right? Like you frame it as Minnesotans aren't being represented in St. Paul. And no matter who you are or what your political or ideological inclinations tend to be, you agree with that. I can't think of anybody who I've had any meaningful political conversation with who feels as though the status quo is for them and what they believe, and that they actually have a voice at the table in determining what policy is in this state. And so you speak directly to that. You say, we need to reform how government works, because these conversations that we're having amongst ourselves in our Facebook comment threads, those are meaningless to the oligarchy. Those are meaningless to the swamp, or whatever new terminology you want to come up with. Maybe swamp's been too tainted by Trump's usage of it, but you got to come up with some sort of imagery that conveys that sense of us versus them, us being the people, them being the establishment.
Well, and if you were to look at every candidate that ran for governor, just about actually any political office, just about everybody is sick of the establishment. They're running, so many people run as anti-establishment candidates, and they get elected, and it's status quo, status quo, status quo. So to say that you're going to reform government is so burned out, because everybody has said that.
Right.
And before I forget, I just looked up the candidates for governor. Mike Murphy is the mayor. There's Michael Marty, who's also filed as a Republican. Tom Bach is still out there as a candidate. I don't know if it's actually running or what. And then we had Josh Swedland, who was a candidate that filed last year that I think already announced he's dropped out. He was an independent party candidate. But those are the candidates that have filed so far. Yeah. One of the things that I just want to talk about at the end of session negotiation, there was a big push by Duesenberg, the Action for Liberty people. A lot of activist groups were saying, don't pass a budget until Walz ends his emergency powers. Don't do it, right? Shut government down, but make him end his powers. It's important that people understand, if Governor Walz ends his emergency and then signs into law the bills that the Republicans have given up to effectively buy their freedom, right? Because that's why I tell people is how much are you willing to pay for your freedom? Because the government just gave us $2.8 billion with basically no holds barred, and we can use that to buy our freedom. Would you like to give Walz the $2.8 billion or however he wants to spend it on unicorns and whatever he wants to spend it on in exchange for him giving us what we should already have? Or do you want to wait till he goes out and campaigns and can't get a hot dog at a gas station because they have one of those signs that says, do not serve this man, with his photo on it, right? I mean, he's going to have to end him either way. But people really wanted that, mostly, I think, because of the mask mandate. That's gone now. So ending his powers isn't going to do much. But we should reform Chapter 12, which would actually prevent him from doing it again. That would be a good, holdout for the negotiation. But I just don't. People have said we really need, that bill, the Never Again bill. Well, it's already kind of in the Constitution that says that the governor shouldn't be able to write laws. Like that's already there. We shouldn't have to force a big change to it, when it's already in the Constitution. We need a court to uphold it. Pennsylvania passed a referendum of the people. So that Pennsylvania has a Republican House and Senate. They passed a voter referendum, like a constitutional amendment, to prevent the governors from having these powers. And the voters just voted on it on Tuesday and permanently stopped the governor from having executive privilege like this. And that was a big win. But they have, of course, a Republican House and Senate. I'm drafting legislation that I'll be introducing during the special session that will be that constitutional amendment. But I don't like to run and change the Constitution every time we want to do something to stop a Democrat governor, right? I mean, it's kind of like it's kind of petty to go to make these changes all the time when constitutionally the governor shouldn't be able to do this anyways. He's abusing his privilege, so we really need the courts to weigh in here. But I'll write it anyways because I think it should be a good push, and we'll see if we can get a hearing on it. So what are your thoughts about trying to buy back our freedoms by negotiating this as part of an end of session deal?
Well, I don't think that you ought to acquiesce to any amount of money that the governor gets to spend unilaterally, because that that is going to go entirely. Look at what they do when they do have to follow some semblance of legislative process, right? All it is funding their own special interests and being incestuous and swampy and giving back to the people who support them electorally. So that's all it's going to be. It's just going to be a bunch of bribes. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's going to be a bunch of bribery straight from the federal government through Governor Walz to all of his constituent groups that are going to try to help him get reelected in 2022. And then he's going to call in all those favors in a few months when it's time to hit the campaign trail. And so, Republicans, to allow that to happen. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Kirk Doubt already has the perfect narrative and talking point for how to oppose this, which is you don't allow the governor to unilaterally appropriate money. It is fundamentally unconstitutional for the governor to be able to spend money without legislative oversight, without your say. Again, it goes back to that premise of Minnesotans, you don't have any representation in St. Paul. Here's another example. Scott Jensen put this out on a mailer, put this out on a Facebook ad. Governor Walz does not want you to have a say in how this money is spent. That's what he's saying. That is his official position. You can say that truthfully. The current sitting governor of the state of Minnesota does not want you as a Minnesotan and a taxpayer to have any say whatsoever over how he spends this money. That's a pretty easy talking point to sell and get across.
Yeah, and so the back of the napkin fiscal deal that was struck the last day of the legislative session, in the last 72 hours, was that Gazelka said, of the $2.8 billion, Walz, you can spend $500 million however you want. And then the rest of the 2.3 or whatever is left over, we'll wait until next legislative session to spend. But giving the governor $500 million is, in effect, giving him a campaign account with $500 million in it. As he goes around to rural Minnesota and says, do you need a new water tower? Do you need a new corn museum? All that kind of stuff. We'll add it to the list. But right now, in these little committees that I talked about, the holdover conference committees, the Democrats are wanting to spend more money in excess of what they were given for a budget target. And so there's a back deal between the Democrats and Governor Walz that they can nibble away at that $500 million to spend money. So they're kind of appropriating in some of it. But there's nothing legislatively preventing the governor from spending all this money. It's just a promise that he's made with Gazelka. If something comes up, he could probably spend $1 billion if he wanted to. But you're right. The governor should not be able to spend the money unilaterally. Kirk Doubt hammered Gazelka for the deal that he struck. But Kirk Doubt is now saying, hey, if you guys want a bonding bill, I may have the votes you need, but you're going to have to come to me to figure out what you want to do to, get the bonding bill through and all the projects that Republicans in the House have. Another bill I need to raise awareness to is a representative from Wilmer introduced a bill because we have so many people on unemployment that are not going back to work. Now, what's the solution to that? Stop the $300 bonuses they're getting sitting on their butt at home, right? The extra bonuses from the federal government, like other Republican governors have done. or I shouldn't say other, like Republican governors have done, ended that to get people back to work. But this Republican introduced legislation to give a bonus payment to people who go get a job. So you get, I don't know, $600 or $900 or whatever it is. If you have a job for 60 days, you'll get an extra bonus on top of that. That is not a Republican solution to get people back to work. They're getting paid to sit home. Let's pay them more to go back to work. No, just cut off the unemployment bonuses, right? The regular employment would stay there, but we're talking about the bonuses. Or we go back to the rules that say if you're going to be on unemployment, you have to be looking for work. For crying out loud, the people today on unemployment don't have to be looking for work. All they have to say is, I don't want to go back to work because I might get COVID. That is a legitimate, under an executive order from Governor Walz, like 20-06. If you don't feel safe at work, you can stay on unemployment. And so we need to get rid of those things and let's get everybody back to work, because employers can't find workers. Restaurants can't find help. A lot of businesses can't find workers. So we need to do those kind of reforms.
Yeah, here, as somebody who manages the workforce, man, it has been painful these past few months. I doubt its authenticity. It's so tone deaf, but Joe Biden apparently had a Facebook post. I reposted it on my page talking about how, it's been 100 days and America's back on track. And it's like, really? Like, should somebody tell him? Like, this is not what being back on track looks or feels like. Like, go into a business, man. Walk onto a factory floor, walk into any place that's trying to hire people and try to tell me that the country's on track. I'm sure your constituents are like your constituency of people who want to sit at home and collect checks and tweet all day. But in those of us out here who actually want to contribute some value and exchange value for value, we're hurting.
Well, guys, it's been a little over an hour here, so I think we should wrap up. It's been a good conversation about things that have happened in the last week. And for those listening, if you have topics you'd like us to cover, please send us an email. You can reach out to me at Jeremy at jeremy@jeremymunson.com, and we'll add your topic to the list of things we'll cover next week. Shaine, Walter, thanks for doing another episode.
Thank you.
And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll tackle this stuff again next week, and as we get closer to the special session.